materias influenciables en extremo. Influenciables en extremo. Influenciables en extremo. Materias influenciables en extremo.
No, maybe we need a code of discretion. I don't want to understand everyone.
Arratsaldeon dizuela guztioi, Bilboko Alhóndigaren izenean ongi etorri Gutun Zuria jaialdiaren 5. ekitaldi hontara. Sé que muchas y muchos habréis venido a escuchar la conversación que van a mantener William Gibson y Rodrigo Fresán, pero os queríamos pedir permiso. Y es que estaba previsto permiso para simplemente 10 minutos. Estaba previsto que ayer estuviera entre nosotros un periodista norteamericano, Philip Gurevich, reconocido periodista. Le resultó completamente imposible viajar hasta Bilbao porque el avión que le traía directamente tuvo problemas mecánicos en la pista de despegue. 24 horas después ha logrado llegar y no quiere perder la oportunidad, lo diré, de dirigirse al público de Bilbao. Entonces nos ha pedido, por favor, la posibilidad o la oportunidad de dirigirse a vosotros durante 10 minutos. His research work talks about ethnic conflicts in Africa, Europe and Asia, political corruption or even music. He has received many awards, mainly for his brilliant report of Rwandan genocide in 1994. Please welcome Philip Gurevich.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I don't speak Spanish or Basque or anything very well but English. It's one of the disadvantages of living in an empire. I wasn't able to be here last night when I was supposed to be here, and I apologize for that, and I was very disappointed in that, and I regret that. And Paul Holdengraber read much of what I had to say, and so I was able to make it today and was asked to speak now briefly. And one of the remarks that in the course of the talk that I had written that Paul spoke last night was a quote from the novelist Robert Stone, a great American novelist, from his very first novel, A Hall of Mirrors, in which the sort of central character, a kind of disillusioned clarinetist who fetches up in the Deep South and gets involved in a lot of strange race hustles and other things, says, "If I had no secrets, how would I know who I am?" I was coming back from Rwanda when I was delayed and wasn't able to make it here. I've been revisiting the country on and off since I first went there about in 1995. And this idea of secrets is actually absolutely central to Rwandan culture, or at least ideas about Rwandan culture and its political culture as well. One of the first things that people I met when I started going to Rwanda, particularly outsiders, would say is, you know, Rwanda is very secretive and people are very deceptive, and a lot of what they'll tell you is not what they really mean, and they'll send you down little side trails and digressions. You'll ask them a question, you'll never get a direct answer, and so forth and so on. And then I went to Rwanda and I started talking to people and I felt like they weren't telling me everything. And sometimes they were lying to me. But it wasn't all that terribly different from elsewhere in that respect. But every once in a while, you'd run into Rwandans who would say, we have this culture of lying here. The kids are told if somebody asks you a question, just tell them anything but how it is. And I went up to northeastern Rwanda at one point when all these cattle keepers were coming back from exile with vast herds of cattle. And you'd meet these guys, and they'd be in basically rags, old men in rags with a staff. You'd say, well, how many cows do you have? They'd say, a few. And you'd say, well, you've got this herd covers most of the hillside and the next valley. And he'd say, I take care of some of my neighbor's cows. And so the guy who was translating for me said, if somebody came to you and asked you, what do you have in your bank account, would you answer? And I thought that was, that's what you need to know. Now, then I met a minister in the new post-genocide government, and he said to me, he was talking about sort of the old mentality and the old politics that he felt had led to the genocide in Rwanda. And he said, deep back, before you get into ethnic divisionism, before you get into all the different ideas that might be obvious about the genocide, you have this idea in Rwanda that like we are a culture of liars. It's not necessarily true, but it becomes true if you keep telling each other that. And he said, we call it ikinamucho, that if you want to do something, you are deceitful and not straight. For example, you can come to kill me. He clutched at his throat. And your mission is successful, but then you cry. That's ikinamucho. So I thought, well, is that really so specifically Rwandan? And I found that as I started to talk to people, I thought, well, if you really are in a culture where people don't tell you everything, then if you do practice honesty, you're actually giving up a certain kind of power because you're giving up options. You're no longer able to maneuver. And I started to realize that in many ways what they're talking about is an oral culture. You have an oral culture where there aren't records. There is only a certain kind of memory. And people are able to say they don't remember anything over and over again. But in fact, what I found is that when you talk to people, when they did claim to remember something, it was much sharper and more acute than most of us in written cultures are able to do anymore. There's a kind of form to it, and it would often have visual cues. They would say, by that tree in this corner, that you could see them tracking themselves through a room as they described a memory. And it often had the quality almost of what I would think of as a legal deposition. It would be very specific, very detailed, and it would be detailed about what they did not know. Again, you can't always count on either what they claim to know and what they claim not to know being a complete truth. But if you checked it out, it started to add up. Then I noticed something else. When I went to visit one particular place where I was developing the story around one killer and the people he had killed during the genocide, and he'd come back from exile in Congo, and I was starting to get the details from different people. But in fact, nobody knows the whole story. People were in a very intense situation. Survivors were mostly hiding. So they saw the genocide through a peephole, through a crack where they could see, but not what was happening outside their immediate range of vision. And even the killers didn't always know. And I went one day to the prison because I knew that there was a guy in the prison who had lived across the street from this killer and who was now obviously imprisoned as also a killer. And I had this list of names of the alleged victims of this killer. And I said to him, what about this guy? And what about that guy? I don't know about that. I was home that day. I had a stomachache that day. The excuses are unbelievable. They're like homework excuses. I was feeling unwell that day, and I didn't look out the window. And then, after a while, he said something, and my translator said, he's saying, if he knows everything, I'm not going to tell him it's not true. And it was something that I've discovered over and over again. If you ask somebody, tell me what happened, they won't necessarily tell you what happened. If you ask somebody, did such and such happen the way I've been told it did, they will answer that question. If you ask somebody, tell me about this situation, there are huge things that they'll leave out. But if you come back and say, well, what about that? They'll fill it in. I was writing about the Rwandan national bicycling team recently, and there's a young guy who I was writing about who is a Hutu bicycle rider from the Northwest who was riding on the national team. And his father had died in 1997. He'd become an orphan and a street child. And 1997, in the area that he was living, was a time of post-genocide, genocidal insurgency, and an enormously fierce counterinsurgency from the government. And a lot of people got killed up there during that period or got hurt. And so when his father died in the middle of that place in that year, I said, well, what did he die of? And he said tuberculosis, which is anything from like AIDS to a heart attack to cancer, is called tuberculosis. It means you're sick. And he said tuberculosis, and he was a drunk. And so he got to the point where he couldn't afford any more booze, and he died. And I said, that's sad. And then I asked around a little bit, and a friend of his said to me, oh yeah, his father was beaten to death by soldiers, or beaten almost to death and then sent back home to die. So I went back to this guy, and I said, we had a long conversation. In the course of it, I said, oh, by the way, you know, when I talked to your friend, he said to me that your father was actually beaten to death by government soldiers. Now, this is the government that's still in place and not a government that always likes dissent. Always doesn't like dissent. And he said, yeah, he told you that because it's true. He didn't blink, he didn't flinch, he didn't wait a second. There was no indication that he'd ever told me something that wasn't true before. And I think that in his mind, he hadn't told me something that wasn't true. He had just given me an answer that was the simplest answer to something that's kind of none of my business. But if I bring it to him and it has become something that I know, he never hesitated to tell me, to confirm it. He never tried to deny it. And since then, we've talked about it from time to time, and I've asked him for greater detail, and he actually doesn't know a whole lot more about the details, but he has a few stories he's collected that he's tried to understand what happened, and he'll tell me those. Does he know more? Perhaps if I were to go and ask around in that neighborhood for a while longer, I'd find out things that I could then go to him for, and he'd confirm or deny them. And there were many, many cases like this, but I thought, on the one hand, you have this prisoner who says, if he knows, I'm not going to hide it. And then I have this guy, Gasori, the bicycle rider. Nothing about him, there's no guilt or innocence involved in his story from his point of view. It's just complex. And I really thought, as I looked at that, how much we often are oversimplifying the stories that we then think people are hiding from us. Why should somebody tell us their story? Why should people come clean? Even in a court of law, people often hold things back, not because they're simply trying to deceive the court, but because, as the Bob Stone character said, if I had no secrets, how would I know who I am? Why should I tell you? What business of yours is it? And in Rwanda, when they came to deal with the question of justice, how to have trials for this, one of the things that they did is they decided to do it in community courts. No lawyers, which many people thought must mean it would be unfair, but the entire community. And it strikes me that if you look at the way that I would gather information, you get a pixel here, you get a pixel there, you get a pixel here, you get a pixel there, and slowly you get a picture, and you start asking people to confirm the picture. Who knows that information? The people who were there. And so they had 12,000 courts set up around the country, which is a small country, so 12,000 courts, it's a very dense number of courts, all with locally elected judges. Most of the judges, by virtue of the population, were Hutu, judging other Hutus, and they had a direct witness coming up to the witness of the community against the word of the killers, or alleged killers or accused killers, and there was a 30% acquittal rate, which is quite high. There was also a high conviction rate, obviously, because there were a lot of murders. And what you had was also a system that rewarded confession, because the idea was we've got to get past the idea that holding all this stuff apart from each other will work. Why would that work? Why would those kinds of secrets and lies break down at that moment? Because you're actually in front of people who know. And that in a system like that, you start to get at a much, much deeper and more complex truth. There was one place that a friend of mine, a researcher, took me, where she said, look, I want you to come with me. I want to show you this one place. She didn't say anything about it. And we went to this place not that far from Kigali. And she said, you know, there's a big massacre here, and we found a survivor who took us out there. And he said, look, on this hillside, hundreds, maybe thousands of people had been herded, and they were never seen again. And there's this very steep hill, and it goes down into a valley. And they said, we've looked in the valley for bones. And you could see where they dug on this hillside at different times, looking for remains. And they'd never found remains. And they had prisoners from the houses that lived all around there who had been accused by various people of being killers, and none of them had ever confessed anything. And it was the one place that I'm aware of in Rwanda where absolutely nobody would break the code of silence. And nobody knew what had happened. Nobody knew where these people were. Nobody believed that there hadn't been a massacre. These people were gone. None of them had come back. And yet, it only happened in one place. And I thought, well, you know, if this really was this country of ikinamucho, of deceit and of lies, that would happen in more places. But this was the system that's been put in place in the aftermath has been a system that's tried to break that down as much as possible. And I started to hear more and more stories that would corroborate my sense. You'd hear about a family in which 3 or 4 people had survived out of a huge family, but they'd all been separate at the time. Each one had their own story. They'd never told each other their own stories. There are 100 reasons why that might be. None of them have to do with lying. All of them might have to do with self-protection, protection of the other one, sensitivity towards their traumas and their feelings. I remember meeting a woman just recently, like 3-4 days ago. I met a woman who told me about a young man who'd come to her. She was a professor at college, and I'll finish in a second with this. And he came to her and he said, listen, you know, my parents were killed during the genocide, and my sisters were abducted by their killers and taken to a camp in the Congo where they were kept in sexual slavery. And now they've come back with their captors, and they want to marry them. And they want me to condone or approve this marriage. And she said, well, you know, you can't understand your sisters, but you can't really tell them that if they're free people now and you feel that they actually are doing this freely, you can't tell them that they can't. And she said, they thought I was nuts. And of course they did. I mean, among other things, they would have 100 different reasons for this, including a sense of, why should I betray my parents? And whatever it was that happened to them, how do I stay loyal to that and think about this and think about all these other things? Listening to stories like this, I slowly realized that in a culture where so many people have been involved in so many complex things, it's not that people are lying always. It's not that people are always projecting secrets at you. It's that when you come in from anywhere outside, that could even be from the neighboring village, that could be as an authority, that could be as anything. One of the things I think people are really keeping is, you can't necessarily understand is the initial impulse. You can't understand the complexity of this. And all of the stories are so much more vastly complex as you start to scratch away at them than the simple versions that we tend to give out when we do journalism and we go in a hurry and we ask somebody the first time and we get something, we say, oh, there's the perpetrator, there's this one. Inside the society, it's so infinitely more complex that the instinct for saying, you know, why should I tell you, is not, in fact, ikinamucho. It's not theater. It's, which is, by the way, what ikinamucho, it turns out, means. It's a kind of respect for the truth rather than lying, is the way I came to feel about it. Certainly they're liars. Certainly they're secret keepers. But I don't think they're probably all that much more disproportionately present than elsewhere. I think what you actually have is a culture in which people who've been through infinitely complex situations, out of a kind of respect for the difficulty of describing them, will hold you off. And ending where I started with that quote from Robert Stone, if I had no secrets, how would I know who I am? I kind of felt like it's not something we really have to worry about. You'll always have them. Thanks. I was told that there's probably time for a question or two.
Si hay alguna pregunta, tenéis ocasión de formularla.
Fantastic. I don't have to lie.
So it's okay.
There's a woman in the middle.
Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Usted cree que cómo podrían todas las culturas tan diferentes que hay en el mundo tener, o sea, una base, un nexo para poder entender algo de los demás? ¿Qué se podría hacer?
Listen. Look. I mean, I don't think it's that complicated. I think that there's an awful lot of information out there. If anything, there's too much information. But, you know, people are very particular at the same time. We're very couched at this point in history in ideas about universal this and universal that. And I think we understand fairly well certain ideas about what we would like universal ideals and rights and so forth to look like. And there's a lot of truth to that. Most cultures would claim that they agree with those things, but they will express them quite differently. And they will express them in terms of the particulars of their historical and political and emotional situation, and many other aspects of that. And I think that trying to understand those particularities is vastly more interesting than trying to generalize. It's more limited. It's harder. It asks a great deal more. It makes it, certainly in my profession, in journalism, there is a sort of widespread foolish notion that to explain complicated situations, you should simplify them. Whereas, in fact, the only way that they start to become comprehensible is if you actually represent their complexity well, because they're complicated. We have no difficulty finding ourselves complicated. We have no difficulty holding in our heads, for instance, that our governments, with the approval of some of our people, can do horrendous things and not necessarily for our entire nation to be a horrendous nation. We can also get the idea that we can do some marvelous things without that meaning that we are a marvelous place. And yet we look at places and kind of go like, that's a dictatorship. I mean, it's like unambiguously bad. Or that one's, you know, a democracy, but it's a complete failure. These are ridiculously uninteresting ways of looking at places. So I think that actually what's really frustrating about trying to understand all the different cultures in the world is you can't. You can't know everywhere as well as you need to. You have to focus on certain things, and you have to find people who have focused on them. And paying very, very, very close attention is much more rewarding than sort of hovering at too vague an altitude, trying to generalize. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Despedimos con un aplauso a Filip Gurevich. Jarraian eta agindutakoari jarraituz, Bilboko Alhóndigi honetan, Gutun Zuriaren gaurko azken ekitaldia, azken bigarrena izango dugu, Gibson eta Rodrigo Fresán izango ditugu hain justu ere orain ikusten dituzuenez. Ekitaldia hau nolabait berezia izango da izan ere amaitzen denean, Alhóndiga Bilbao decía que será un acto un tanto especial porque cuando finalice Alhóndiga Bilbao os quiere invitar a todos y a todas a una copa que ofrecerá aquí fuera de vino junto con el propio Gibson, que ofrecerá un trato más cercano y más incluso personal si queréis. Podréis hablar con él a la vez que tomáis un vino. Antes de ayer fue norteamericano, ayer chacolí y hoy vuelve a ser en californiano, concretamente en Marimar State, Sonoma, que ofrece la tienda Shopa. Os dejo con ellos. Un aplauso.
Hola, buenas noches. Bueno, muchas gracias por estar aquí y no estar viendo un partido de fútbol. Creo que Gibson no necesita de ninguna presentación, pero voy a establecer algunas coordenadas básicas para luego pasar directamente al diálogo con él. Bueno, William Gibson nació en 1948, nacido en Estados Unidos, canadiense por adopción y decisión, en algún momento etiquetado con el rótulo de profeta noir del cyberpunk, inventor del término ciberespacio, lo cual también me gustaría que luego me contara qué se siente haber inventado una palabra, que muchos escritores pueden escribir muchos libros, pueden inventar muchos personajes, pero ingresar una palabra en los diccionarios es algo, no sé, creo que Cervantes y Nabokov lo consiguieron, más o menos. Y voy a citar un par de cosillas, una de Mundo Espejo, que es el título en español de Pattern Recognition, que es una de sus novelas más conocidas, ya para entrar en el tema que nos ocupa hoy. Allí, abro comillas, se lee: ahora no tenemos la menor idea de qué o quiénes serán los habitantes de nuestro futuro. Desde este punto de vista no tenemos futuro alguno, o al menos no en el sentido que nuestros abuelos lo tuvieron o pensaron que lo tenían. Aquellos futuros, detallada y culturalmente imaginados, fueron un lujo de otra época en el que la hora duraba mucho más. En cambio, para nosotros las cosas pueden cambiar tan abrupta y violentamente que el futuro de nuestros abuelos no tiene un ya al que sujetarnos. No tenemos futuro porque nuestro futuro es tan volátil. Lo único que tenemos es la gestión de riesgos, ese constante girar de determinadas posibilidades de un determinado momento. Y en su último libro publicado, que no ha salido hace demasiado tiempo en español, Historia Cero, a propósito de ese libro que cierra su última trilogía por el momento, Gibson declaró que todo lo que en realidad tenemos cuando simulamos escribir sobre el mañana es ese momento en el que estamos escribiendo. Lo que a mí me interesa es la versión libremente alucinada del presente o del ayer inmediato. Lo que yo pensaba para entrar en el título del encuentro, que es Secretos y Mentiras, quisiera preguntarle a Gibson qué fue lo que ocurrió, porque para la ciencia ficción, aunque yo no creo que él sea un escritor de ciencia ficción, en un principio el futuro era un secreto que había que develar de algún modo. Y de un tiempo a esta parte, para la novelística futurística o inmediatamente futurística, el futuro parece haberse convertido en una mentira. Entonces, ¿qué fue lo que ocurrió? El futuro está más cerca del presente, el presente dura más.
I think that the future began to arrive in a very wholesale way. At the beginning of the 20th century, the phrase the 21st century would have been extraordinarily resonant for many people, as indeed it was for me in my childhood. Today, the phrase the 23rd century isn't resonant at all. You don't see people looking forward with keen interest and anticipation to what might be happening 100 or 200 years in the future. That somehow that's no longer part of our cultural moment. Some people view science fiction as it was in my childhood as an expression of a particular historical moment. It came out of a day in which the present might be 3 or 4 years long. When you were asked about the present. Today, the present is today, because we know from life experience that tomorrow everything can be different as a result of a single news story. And that's new, and it's taken away the room in the space in which we were previously able to construct elaborate models of where we might go. I think we no longer have that luxury.
Y desde un punto de vista, no sé, cultural, ideológico, psicológico o biológico, ¿usted piensa que hemos ganado algo o hemos perdido algo con ese cambio? Con esa especie de formación de la idea del futuro. ¿Estamos mejor que antes respecto al futuro?
I don't really see what we have to compare it with. We haven't been in this situation before, or we haven't been in this situation before quite this consciously, because in fact the record of science fiction and of futurism, the record of it accurately predicting things hasn't really been very good. The real future, when we arrive at it, is always the present moment, and it's always infinitely more complex and complicated and compromised than any single individual's act of imagination could be.
En su último libro, que es una colección de ensayos y de piezas periodísticas que se llama Distrust That Particular Flavor, que no ha sido todavía traducido al español, es un libro que, a pesar de ser una recopilación de textos dispersos, de algún modo también puede leerse como lo más parecido a una autobiografía que ha escrito William Gibson, que has escrito hasta ahora. De hecho, hay piezas allí muy puntuales donde se narra tu infancia y tu desarrollo y tus primeras impresiones como futuro escritor de ciencia ficción. Hay un momento muy emocionante que es cuando llega el televisor, que es como el primer artefacto futurístico que aterriza en la sala de la casa del niño que fue William Gibson. Y al mismo tiempo, en otros textos y en reportajes he leído que ya te refieres a la época en que vivimos como la edad de la postcomputadora, como que la computadora o el ordenador ya ha quedado atrás. Quería saber qué sentías habiendo vivido esos dos momentos en una misma vida, como el principio de la tecnología moderna y algo que ya empieza a ser otra cosa, y quisiera que explicaras qué es lo que está empezando a ocurrir ahora.
Well, I witnessed the arrival, excuse me, I witnessed the arrival of broadcast television and lived through the age of broadcast television, which probably now is edging its way off the stage. But I can't tell you what it did to us, because I have become that to which broadcast television happened. I have become that which watches broadcast television, and it's more difficult for me to imagine what the world was like before broadcast television than it is for me to imagine where it, where we really might be going. The world before the advent of a powerful, ubiquitous technology is more mysterious than the world that technology is taking us to. And I think that's also true of the first era of the digital, which probably began about 1945, although it didn't really impact most of us for quite a few years after that. My feeling is that that's probably ending now, and we're going into another stage of technology that will make that first digital age seem very primitive.
Ujú.
But I can't articulate, or I have no way of knowing exactly what it's done to us. I can only approach it as a writer of fiction with a sort of literary naturalism that may be equipped to deal with aspects of the world today that previous kinds of literary naturalism are unable to grasp.
Y la edad de la postcomputación en la que nos adentramos ahora, ¿cuáles serán los efectos residuales o el aftershock de eso? ¿Hacia dónde vamos? ¿Cuál sería la próxima era?
I think that cyberspace, for want of a better term, is colonizing the physical in a way that I didn't anticipate. I didn't anticipate at all. It's turning itself inside out, and we increasingly live our daily lives within it. I suspect that our descendants will look at us, and the thing that they'll find quaintest and most peculiar about us is our residual insistence on the difference between the real and the virtual. I don't think that people if we keep going the way we're going, I don't think people in the future will understand that distinction, and very likely that distinction won't be there for them. In a world of genuinely evolved interface technology, there won't be a gap between cyberspace and the present moment. I think it will all be one unimaginable one.
¿Y qué pasará con la literatura en todo eso? Me refiero porque yo creo que los escritores futuristas o anticipatorios o de ciencia ficción o como quiera llamárselo, me parece que los más vulgares, los menos interesantes son aquellos exclusivamente preocupados en que lo que predicen se haga realidad y sienten como una especie de felicidad orgásmica cuando eso ocurre, ¿no? Digamos, podrían ser los descendientes de Julio Verne. Arthur C. Clarke me parece que era un escritor muy preocupado con que lo que él decía que iba a ocurrir ocurriese y se sentía muy feliz cada vez que eso sucedía. Parece que lo tuyo es diferente, que no hay una preocupación por más que el ciberespacio haya ocurrido de una manera mucho más poderosa que cualquier invención que haya propuesto Arthur C. Clarke. Pero a mí lo que me interesa son las tramas y las subtramas. Me parece que lo que anticipas tú y lo que es real y lo que está en el presente son los diferentes pliegues de la realidad. Volviendo al tema de secretos y mentiras, a mí me parece que te ha tocado vivir tres momentos muy claves en ese sentido, que podrían ser el asesinato de Kennedy, la guerra de Vietnam, cuando se perdió ya un poco esa especie de cuestión maniquea de los chicos buenos de la película y los malos de la película, y los atentados del World Trade Center, que son cosas que aparecen en tus libros siempre de un modo u otro. Quería saber cuánto te interesa la conspiración como tema, la idea de la conspiración. Y si vivimos en un mundo conspirativo, tanto como aparece en tus novelas.
I think that the appeal of conspiracy theory lies in the relative simplicity of any given conspiracy theory. The world of the conspiracy theorist is a radically simplified world, and I think that conspiracy theory actually comforts us because it offers us conspiracies that are comprehensible. It isn't that I don't believe in conspiracy, because there's obviously conspiracy in the world, but theories of the world being run by the Bilderbergs or theories of the protocols of the elders of Zion. The appeal, part of the appeal to those theories is that they're incredibly simplistic. And in fact, if someone can, I believe that if someone can explain some part of human history to you over the course of 2 beers, it can't be true. It's a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are, the whole field of conspiracy theory is incredibly fascinating and informative as mythology. And that, for me, that's primarily the value. I look at conspiracy theories for insight into cultural pathologies, but not, I don't look to it for models of how the world works. I think the world is too complex and shifty to be defined over the course even of 6 beers.
Cuando uno lee a William Gibson, lo que ocurre, como ocurre con muchos grandes escritores, es que luego empieza a experimentar momentos William Gibson constantemente. Un momento William Gibson más o menos reciente que tuve yo fue no hace mucho cuando Steve Jobs estaba presentando en directo en todas las televisiones del mundo, lo cual ya era muy impresionante eso, que todos los noticieros conectaran en directo para ver a un magnate informático presentando el iPad. Entonces, noticia planetaria universal, entonces estaba Steve Jobs hablando y de repente en la base de la pantalla del televisor empezaron a aparecer letras y decía noticia de último momento, ha muerto J.D. Salinger. Y yo lo sentí como un verdadero momento de novela de William Gibson, donde todo el tiempo están ocurriendo esas interferencias. Lo que me interesaba saber es si William Gibson, luego de haber escrito los libros que escribió, va por la vida experimentando momentos William Gibson. Si le parece todo raro, si le parece todo normal lo que ocurre, si no es un poco, si es molesto o es aterrorizante que el mundo cada vez se parezca más a las fantasías de uno. Y básicamente cómo se le ocurre una idea a William Gibson. Quisiera conocer un poco la mecánica, si se puede saber.
Well,
perdón, espero que este no sea el momento donde vas a decir que recibes un rayo de otro planeta y que mete ideas en tu cabeza y te transmiten directamente.
Well, I'll go back to my having mentioned naturalism earlier.
Mm-hmm.
When I see something in the world that strikes me as, if you will, Gibsonian, I don't take it to be proof of my ability as a fortune teller. I take it to be an indication that my literary naturalism is working to some degree, because I believe that all fiction is speculative, in that each writer of fiction constructs a world out of a blank sheet of paper or screen, as the case may be, and asks the reader to judge the correspondence between the constructed world and the reader's experience of reality. And this holds, I think, equally true with a detective story or a science fiction story or an extremely serious literary novel. I think it's really what we go to. It's what we go to fiction for. So I don't think that speculative element belongs exclusively to the fantastic. And sometimes literal realism in our world today strikes me as inherently fantastic. But as for ideas, I don't look for ideas, and I don't think of myself as someone who deals in ideas. As I go about my daily life, I've developed some sort of mechanism that notices and collects bits, sort of instinctively, bits of reality, of what's really going on in the world. I sort of toss them into a basket behind me, and they accumulate, and they stay there, and somehow, if I'm lucky, they start to the bits and pieces start to interact with one another until something emerges from the basket that has sufficient novelty value for me to start imagining a narrative around it. And in the course of that, I discover ideas. I don't think of myself as being a didactic writer. I think of myself as being an exploratory writer, and it's just through the process itself, the narrative eventually will, if it works for me, I'll discover a new idea for myself through the process of narrative.
Eso es interesante lo que acabas de mencionar, porque a mí me parece que buena parte del género de la novelística de ciencia ficción pertenece a la novela de idea. Generalmente las novelas de ciencia ficción giran alrededor de una idea o de un paisaje, mientras que tus novelas son novelas de ideas realmente. Hay una acumulación de ideas y me interesó mucho eso que decías que se iba interconectando, pero yo voy a ser más puntual y voy a ser más exigente a la hora de preguntarte cómo surge la idea, por ejemplo en Historia Cero, de ligar el mundo de la moda y de la alta costura a la industria militar, y de dónde sale la figura esta sombra a veces más clara, a veces más oscura del magnate Big End en tus últimas novelas. Quiero decir, cuando tú lo veías a Steve Jobs por televisión, decías, ahí va un personaje mío, es un personaje de William Gibson, Steve Jobs.
No,
Pero voy a ser más específico. El dolor mundial, las muestras de desgarrarse las vestiduras, de poner velas y manzanas frente a las tiendas Apple cuando murió Steve Jobs, Eso es una novela de William Gibson, es de una novela de William Gibson. Lo siento mucho.
Yes, yes. No, I thought that was a remarkable moment. It's a strange. It always fascinates me when something we've associated with religion migrates to the secular in a really overt way. That's quite an extraordinary thing.
Y cuando ves eso, dices, ¿por qué no se me habrá ocurrido a mí? O dices, qué bueno que ocurrió.
Well, I say my
Mixture.
yeah, my mixture is working. It's what I'm modeling is corresponding to some degree with the world outside my window. So it's satisfying in that regard. But I'm still capable of a completely human, completely civilian, oh my God, that's weird, response. And I think I'd be lost without. I think I'd be lost without that. And as for where the relationship between fashion designers and the Pentagon that I describe in Zero History, the answer to that is simply that it exists. I wasn't making that up. I happened to encounter a really remarkable example of that when I was asked to participate in the initial branding meetings for a new line of civilian clothing that a very large sportswear manufacturer was undertaking. They were preparing to create a brand which they've subsequently launched, and I can't tell you which one because I signed non-disclosure agreements. But in the course of
Secrets.
Yeah, secrets. And formal secrets. In the course of doing that, I discovered that this company was making a sizable portion of their income designing for the U.S. military. And it was, to some extent, a secret. That became clear immediately. They went, yeah, we do that, but we. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And they go, well, okay. And they wanted to tell me more, but there's like, it's not exactly a secret, but don't tell anyone. And you did sign that agreement. So I started looking at that and sort of looking around the world and looking around the internet for examples of that, and it just struck me as an extraordinarily odd thing. I mean, if you're a snowboard clothing manufacturer and you really want to make a lot of recession-proof money, there's nothing better that you can do than get a U.S. military contract. And it's so very odd. These brands that you would never in your life associate with doing that, they're doing it. It's not just one.
un tiempo después del 11 de septiembre del 2001, que es uno de los acontecimientos claves de tu novela Pattern Recognition, que se llama Mundo Espejo en español. Unos días después de que sucediese eso, circuló una leyenda urbana que era que el presidente Bush había convocado a los escritores más importantes de ciencia ficción porque estaba profundamente desconcertado por lo sucedido y quería que le explicasen qué podía llegar a ocurrir ahora, después de eso. Yo lo leí. Y entre los nombres de los convocados, el primero que figuraba era un tal William Gibson. Yo supongo que si esto fue así no puedes decirme si fue real o no, tal como me dijiste de la línea de ropa, pero me puedes mentir y puedes decirme que no fue así. Entonces lo que yo te preguntaría es si te hubiera encantado ir, si hubieras recibido la invitación, hubiera sido. Y segundo, si tendrías algo para aconsejarle realmente a un presidente norteamericano en cuanto a lo que puede llegar a caerles encima del cielo. Con esto quiero preguntar si un escritor de futurismo de ciencia ficción tiene una función social y es responsable. O se siente responsable de lo que puede llegar a ocurrir.
Well, science fiction writers in the United States, and I am not myself one of them, are sometimes asked to sit down with DARPA, the defense idea farm, or to talk to the CIA in a sort of very generalized scenario spinning process. And the closest I've ever come to advising the U.S. government is that I've been for many years I was for many years a totally inactive member of something called the Global Business Network, and Brian Eno was another member, and the Global Business Network was a futurological consulting firm that would, if you were a large corporation or government and you paid GBN would sit down and generate a lot of different scenarios for you of where your situation might be going. The goal being to prepare reduce the shock that would occur when one of those possibilities actually impacted whatever entity you worked for. And GBN sometimes did consulting for the U.S. government, although I never was directly involved with any of those things. And in fact, I've tended to shy away from that aspect of it, and I really can't imagine what I would have said to President Bush had he asked my advice. Something like, whatever you're thinking of doing, don't do that. Seek wiser counsel. Don't talk to science fiction writers.
Esas reuniones que describías se parecían peligrosamente a una serie de televisión de J.J. Abrams. Y entonces aprovechaba para preguntarte si te habías sentido estafado por el último episodio de Lost o no.
You know, I'm a really one of the ways in which I am genuinely peculiar and strange is the extent to which my life has been, since the mid-'60s, cut off from broadcast television. So I'm actually one of the few people in the world who's never seen any episode of Lost. I gathered from conversation on the internet that the final episode was not very satisfying.
No.
And
En absoluto.
I also, what that reminded me of was the final episode of the X-Files, which I did see, and which was completely unsatisfying.
Yo cuando veo estas series ahora pienso cuánto más nutritivo, satisfactorio y económico era lo que proponían series como The Twilight Zone, por ejemplo, en 20 minutos y no en 8 años, ¿no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If it hadn't been for the first season of The Twilight Zone, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today.
Pero lo que sí me lleva de la televisión al cine, porque sí has comentado, quería preguntarte algunas cosas alrededor del cine de género y de ciencia ficción. Primero me interesaría saber qué piensas de 2001, Odisea del Espacio de Stanley Kubrick, que para mí, paradójicamente, es la película que mejor ha envejecido de ciencia ficción, menos su título, que ya envejeció por completo. Tiene esa paradoja, ¿no? Luego, leí en alguna parte que cuando te sentaste a ver por primera vez Blade Runner, te levantaste del cine y no pudiste soportar verla porque sentías que eso se parecía demasiado a lo que tenías dentro de tu cabeza y lo que querías escribir. Y por tercero, para terminar con el último gran hito sci-fi, quería saber qué pensabas de que viviendo en una época tan ciberespacial, tan computarizada, tan Twitter, tan Facebook, la película más exitosa de ciencia ficción de todos los tiempos haya sido algo tan retrógrado como Avatar, en términos de género, que es como volver a la ciencia ficción de los años 30 o 40, ¿no?
Oh, in reverse order.
Okay.
I think that the most interesting parallel for the theatrical release of Avatar is the theatrical release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And if you go back and look at the reviews of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, there were very respectable critics and filmmakers saying, that's the most astonishing piece of cinema that's ever been made. And what they were, I think that what they were responding to was really powerfully new piece of technology. We look at it today. It was like Technicolor, you know, and it was Technicolor, and it was absolute state-of-the-art animation. When we look at it today, we can't see it that way. It's what it is. And I think that Avatar will probably looks like that already, but if it doesn't, it will. When we're completely accustomed to that technology, we'll just see a very orthodox piece of science fiction.
No tendrá que ver, lo pregunto como a un especialista, una especie de necesidad de recuperar la inocencia de lo que se suponía que iba a ser el futuro de pensar que el futuro está en otro planeta y está lejos y ya no está instalado en la Tierra, porque ya no viajamos más al espacio.
Well, I was forced into my search for the word cyberspace by the lack of an arena in which to create stories, because the biggest traditional arena of the science fiction of my childhood had been outer space, and the way you moved through that arena was with a spaceship, and neither of those were resonant for me in the mid-1970s when I started thinking of writing. So cyberspace was literally the result of a need to find an arena in which I could do science fiction. Excuse me. The last place today where, as a reader, I expect to be adequately entertained by science fiction is space travel. Mm-hmm. I can't remember when I last read anything set in an imaginary future with space travel that I found satisfactorily stimulating. So that was a sort of dead issue. It was for me. It had become like a sort of kitsch, an indicator of kitsch, and mm-hmm. I wanted to read and to write stories set somewhere else.
¿Y Blade Runner y 2001 siguen siendo importantes?
Well, I think so. I mean, in my personal cinema of science fiction, they're both terrifically important. With 2001, and I love the title 2001. I'm glad it has that title, just as I'm glad that 1984 is called 1984. And even though we know that Orwell meant it to mean 1948, the year in which he wrote it, 2001 is the result of a completely empowered genius filmmaker doing something very, very big that I can't even imagine happening today. I can't imagine that film being made today. Someone told me about 15 years ago, as a Hollywood director who seemed to know what he was talking about, told me that 15 years ago, Blade Runner to make it then would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And he said, I don't know if there'll ever be another film like that. Like Ridley got in and did that at the last minute that anyone could possibly afford to do it. And it was a box office failure, which mm-hmm. is something we tend to forget.
Sí, lo que nos lleva al tema de la edad y de cómo la edad es particularmente cruel con ciertos hitos de la ciencia ficción, ¿no? Es un género que envejece a veces mucho más rápido y mucho peor que otros géneros. Lo que quería preguntarte en ese sentido es ¿qué te pasa hoy cuando relees o piensas en una novela como Neuromancer? ¿La sientes que ha envejecido? ¿Te sientes satisfecho? Dices, no está mal, se mantiene bien. ¿Alguna vez pensaste en reescribirla o agregarle partes, por ejemplo?
Well, when I wrote Neuromancer, I assumed that it would age as tragically as any other piece of imaginary future that's ever been written. I mean, to my mind, we cannot love that genre without taking active pleasure in the patina of quaintness and falseness that inevitably accrues to any imagined future. You put the last period on the manuscript and the thing starts to obsolete. It's like an ice cream cone melting on your hand. It's claiming to go in one direction, and history is going in the other. Even when I was 14 or 15 years old, I loved reading science fiction that had been written in the 1940s because of that. I loved how they got it wrong. And I've always thought that that's actually a pleasure of that stuff. But and if I were a 13-year-old reading Neuromancer today, I'd get 10 or 15 pages into it, and I'd think, I got it. The plot is going to turn around whatever has happened to all the cell phones. Because that was something that, that's a little piece of personal technology that I didn't see coming. And had I had the idea, okay, they've all got small radio-equipped digital telephones in their pockets. Had I imagined that, I would have had this terrible technical novelistic problem with integrating that technology into the story, because so much would change. They'd all be in touch. They'd all be talking. There'd be too much dialogue. Yeah. It would have been more difficult to depict that than it was for me to depict my imaginary version of cyberspace.
Pero a propósito de lo que dijiste de los teléfonos móviles, ¿no tienes la impresión de que es un mundo un poco idiota en el que los teléfonos evolucionaron tanto en tan poco tiempo y los aviones siguen demorando lo mismo, por ejemplo? No hay algo... Quiero decir, la ciencia ficción siempre proponía un futuro donde todo evolucionaba más o menos parejo, al mismo tiempo.
Well, the airplane belongs to the previous era.
Es un invento victoriano.
Yeah. It seems like it's a Victorian invention. I think it might be more difficult to imagine a world without cellular telephones than to imagine a world without airplanes. We might be more uncomfortable without the cellular telephones.
Pero tenemos más tiempo, porque yo no sé si que alguna autoridad me diga algo. No ustedes, alguna autoridad quiero. No, es que no veo nada allí. 10 minutos. Bueno, muy rápidamente entonces. Hablabas recién de leer ciencia ficción cuando era joven, y otra cosa que a mí me parece, leyendo tus libros, que también deberías leer y muy atentamente, es novela noir, ¿no? Policiales. Me parece que en todos tus libros siempre hay mutaciones de detectives privados, ¿no? Pueden ser hackers, pueden ser cool hunters, pero siempre está como la sombra del detective privado ahí detrás. Quería saber si algún autor policial te había marcado especialmente.
I think that probably really Conan Doyle. And I remember my mother gave me a 2-volume complete Sherlock Holmes when I was, I think, 10 years old. And I read the whole thing cover to cover and started again. And that was the beginning of a fondness for detective fiction, but it was also an astonishing lesson in world building, because Conan Doyle's London in the Sherlock Holmes stories is a completely unreal and fantastic place, but it's so coherent. It's all so perfectly, cozily of a piece that it's still a good, he's still a good model to go to for describing an alien civilization. I mean, he didn't think he was describing an alien civilization, but for us it is, however cozy it may be.
Y Chandler y Hammett luego también tuvieron algo que ver.
Well, I'm Hammett much more directly than Chandler. I've never been actually very fond of Chandler's fiction, but I'm sure it's affected me osmotically in a sort of secondhand way. I like Robert Altman's film of The Long Goodbye much more than I like any Chandler novel itself, but Altman was doing something really interesting to Chandler in making that film, and I think that Hammett arguably invented that particular form of detective fiction, and that Chandler found a way to...
Más sentimental, ¿no?
Yeah, it's a more sentimental, more bourgeois.
A mí me hace acordar mucho a Fitzgerald, Chandler. Es como el gran Gatsby en clave noir.
Yes,
¿no?
yes.
Y también otra cosa que me había interesado es que muchas veces has nombrado a Thomas Pynchon y has dicho que Philip Dick no te interesa tanto, que para mucha gente sería automáticamente la persona a quien acercarte, ¿no?
Yeah, I think that I got my vitamins of a certain kind, my vitamins of paranoia from Pynchon rather than from Dick.
Okay. Bueno, para terminar, una pregunta en dos partes. Es algo que hay que preguntarle a todo escritor de ciencia ficción, por más que a ti el tema no te interese, por lo que se ve en tu obra. La primera parte de la pregunta es si piensas si hay vida inteligente en otros planetas. Y la segunda parte es si piensas si hay vida inteligente en la Tierra. La última parte de la pregunta viene a propósito de esta cantidad de libros que están saliendo ahora, como The Shallows de Nicholas Carr y un montón de libros que dicen que el Google e Internet nos está pudriendo la cabeza y que cada vez vamos a tener menos capacidad de concentración y de memorización y que vamos camino a convertirnos en meros apéndices de máquinas con tracción a sangre, ¿no? Somos como una especie de enchufe donde se enchufa una máquina finalmente.
Well, I see no reason to not imagine life elsewhere in the universe. But given the scale of the universe, it's quite likely that the nearest life is very, very, very far away, and it may be a very long time.
O no les interesamos en absoluto también, puede ser.
Yeah, possibly. Or they are incapable of recognizing us as
intelligent.
as intelligent, or vice versa. Here, we, in terms of the scale of deep time in the universe, our species is just like a firefly blinking once.
Okay.
The universe is very large and very, very long. And we are, the Copernican revelation that we are not the center is probably one of the smartest things we've ever come up with. And it unfolds endlessly. Not only are we not the center, but we're probably not very long for this.
Mm-hmm.
Not very long for this universe. What we think of as intelligence, may not even in the end turn out to have been that good an adaptive strategy. And what was the final?
Si somos inteligentes nosotros. Si hay vida inteligente o somos cada vez menos inteligentes, ¿no?
Oh, well, I know we're the people, the author of The Shallows and the other people who are telling us that we're becoming iPad-driven pond scum.
Perdón, el libro de Shallows se ha publicado en España, se llama Superficiales. Digo, para que...
That, to me, that's a very old message. That's after us, the deluge.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, it's as far as you can go back in any surviving literature from our past, you can find somebody saying that to the next generation of, the true civilization is over. Look at you. And, the ancient Greeks were doing this. Everyone seems to, it just seems to be something that human beings do, and they tend to do it when they get to be a certain age. And I've always found it particularly embarrassing to see science fiction writers I admire do it. And often they do, and I just sort of shake my head and try not to pay too much attention. But my response to it really is sort of a variant of the Copernican revelation, and it's not just that I am not the center, but that I was not the crown of creation. My generation was not the last generation of actual intelligent human beings. And the proof is that every generation claims that at some point.
Entonces, puestos a elegir mejor secretos que mentiras, entonces.
I think Mr. Big End, the quasi-demonic character of mine you mentioned earlier, says at one point that so he says, like, why are you willing to pay all this money just to get like these random secrets? And he says, because secrets are really cool. And I think secrets, I think we all we're all drawn to the idea of secrets like that, and inside information, and what the people who are really doing it really know. But I suspect that if you could freely access the knowledge of the ex-presidents of various democracies, they probably would turn out not to know very much. You probably wouldn't come away with your pocket stuffed with marvelous secrets. You'd probably come away knowing
Mentiras.
a lot of knowing about many lies.
Pues bueno, nada más de mi parte. No sé si va a haber posibilidad de hacer preguntas, o si alguien quiere preguntar algo. Están allí.
If may I ask? I will try to express myself in English. Indulge me. When you were writing Neuromancer using your typewriter, you create such a powerful vision that is still enlightening the developments of today. And what I miss in today's technology is that magic that you can find in your books behind all those technology. Do you think that there is a spirit in today's technology? There is a spirit in the machine?
It's something I try to be agnostic about that. I don't know. I don't think the typewriter was magic. But I don't think the computer is magic either. They're both examples of something that we've been doing as a species for a long time now. And the speed at which we're able to do it, keep that technological ball rolling along, has gradually been speeding up for the last 200 years or so, and shows no sign of slowing down. As to whether it's good or bad, I think I lose some really important part of my function as a writer if I decide either way. I'm not really here for that. I'm here to observe how people make the thing roll and what they do with it, and to let the reader make the call on whether or not it's good or bad.
What's your viewpoint on the 2012 phenomenon, or as Terence McKenna once pointed out, the balkanization of apocalyptic ideas coming together?
I think there's going to be an enormous amount of printed material to be composted in 2013. I really don't. I don't think it's going to happen. The Mayans didn't say anything was going to happen. It's all actually founded on tragicomic and ridiculous misinterpretation of archaeology. I mean, absolutely nothing's going to happen. It's, remember the Y2K bug? It's like nothing. Nothing. That's what, about the only thing in the world I'm sure of is that there will be no Mayan apocalypse in 2012. Something else might happen. You can blame me if I'm wrong.
Hola, aprovechando la mención que ha hecho Rodrigo a la novela negra, y aunque bueno, no venga mucho a caso al tema, yo quisiera aprovechar para felicitarle por la publicación en roja y negra de los cuentos de Archer de Ross MacDonald y aprovechar para preguntarle qué se va a publicar en esta colección y qué pasa con los clásicos, que aparte de MacDonald no se ha publicado nada.
¿Puedo responder a esto o estoy fuera de mi jurisdicción? Pues que no sé.
La pregunta es para usted.
Te lo respondo luego afuera. Aprovechen lo que está él aquí, me parece.
Vale,
luego
acuerdo.
Ahí quedamos afuera y te lo cuento.
De acuerdo, gracias.
Pero no puedo revelar demasiado. ¿De dónde viene el nombre de Hubertus? Un nombre tan antiguo para un personaje tan futurista.
Well, the names are found objects for me. I stumble on them and they have a kind of magic for me. But no, there's no symbolic logic.
Big End also?
It's an actual Belgian name, which is a very funny one in English.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hola, buenas tardes. Escuchando un poco esta entrevista, estoy viendo lo que he visto también en libros como Neuromante, una visión un poco pesimista, un poco en la que en realidad el mundo está lleno de gente un poco mala y que esto es un poco pesimista todo.
El mundo está lleno de gente mala, te digo.
Al hilo de esto, en Neuromante, por ejemplo, hay un montón de ideas en las que se muestra esa maldad que parece que está siempre dentro de nosotros. Y hay un concepto que me gustaría saber de dónde sale, si es que tiene alguna idea de la que ha venido, que es el concepto de la casa de muñecas, que me parece un concepto muy, muy interesante y que da juego a mucha imaginación por detrás de... Es una perversión del ser humano que es no explícita, sino implícita y que deja lugar a mucha imaginación de maldad, si viene de alguna idea. Gracias.
It comes from... It's an extrapolation of the commodification of women. So I thought of it as it was a feminist, a sort of feminist critique for me. It was a technological extrapolation of prostitution in a patriarchal society. And as for I don't actually think of my vision, if I can call it that, as being particularly pessimistic. It's Neuromancer was written at a time in which the most reasonable expectation of an informed individual was that the United States and the Soviet Union would destroy the entire world one day for no particular reason, because they were poised and fully enabled to do that. When that particular nightmare ended, we all, perhaps for the sake of our emotional health, decided to suffer a kind of global amnesia about how horrible it was. So, but writing in 1982, writing about a future in which that had not only not happened, but was never going to happen, struck me as a fundamentally optimistic act. the fact that the human beings I was depicted hadn't gotten any better than a lot of the human beings in the world today just struck me as realism. And people have said that neuromancer is a terribly dark world. Well, it's a somewhat dark world, but there are people all over this planet tonight who would migrate to it instantly if given the choice, and they would be much better off than where they're living. It's not true for us, but it's true for people in some other parts of the world.
Es un mensaje muy esperanzador para la España de hoy. Pero bueno. Quédense.
Yo quisiera hacer una pregunta no tanto al escritor, sino como a la persona. Por un lado, saber qué se siente al ser una persona que tiene un inicio de libro, que es uno de los más citados y es mítico en la historia de la ciencia ficción, como es el caso de Neuromante. Y por otro lado, ¿qué está leyendo ahora mismo?
Well, there's a bittersweet pleasure in having the first line of one's first novel frequently quoted. Because one thinks, well, I've done more since then. Why don't they ever quote the first lines of the other one? So it's, it's I'm sort of ambivalent about that. What am I reading? Right now I'm reading Mark Derry's nonfiction essay collection, I Must Not Think Bad Thoughts. I'm reading Harry Kunzu's really terrifically wonderful novel, Gods Without Men.
Very good.
And I very much hugely enjoyed Nick Harkaway's second novel, Angel Maker, which came out a couple of months ago.
And writing?
And writing, I'm in the early sort of not quite writing stages of a next novel which is, I suspect, will not be set in, it will neither be set in the present nor will it be a historical novel. We'll leave it at that.
Well, to finish, tell us the first line.
I don't even have the first line for that one. But I have to have a first line in order to begin. So when I have the first line, we will have commenced.
Pues me parece que con la idea de la primera línea de lo que vendrá de William Gibson en suspenso, llegamos a la última línea de esta conversación. Y eso ha sido todo. Muchas gracias por venir.
Somos materias influenciables en extremos.